Hello everyone! Today we will tell you a few stories about people who were supposed to uphold order in society, but broke the law and received severe punishments. And yes, it didn't go without death sentences. And we'll start with an ongoing story about 6 police officers from Mississippi who called themselves the Execution Squad. This name suits them well because they are being tried for torturing 2 African-American men. The Execution Squad chose stun guns and sex toys as instruments for their sadistic games. Former Rankin County Sheriff's deputies Christian Dedman, Hunter Elwood, Brett McAlpin, Jeffrey Middleton, and Daniel Opdyke, as well as former Richland police officer Joshua Hartfield, have all pleaded guilty to charges that include assault and obstruction of justice. Dedman, Elwood, and Opdyke have also pleaded guilty to 3 federal criminal charges. Dedman electrocuted a white man and fired a gun near his head to force him to confess. Elwood and Opdyke were present and did not intervene. The sentencing for the former police officers will take place in mid-November, but it can already be said that it won't be light punishment. Dedman and Elwood face a maximum sentence of 120 years in prison and a fine of $2.75 million. Hartfield and Middleton face a possible sentence of 80 years in prison and a fine of $1.5 million. McAlpin faces 90 years in prison and a fine of $1.75 million, and Opdyke could be sentenced to 100 years in prison with a fine of $2 million. But it's not just the United States that sees unrest. For example, in 2015, all eyes were on the trial in Israel of a police major, a prosecutor, and a lawyer. How did these 3 end up in the same boat? Lawyer Ronald Fisher, prosecutor Ruth David, and police major Aaron Malka were on trial for conspiracy. Aaron Malka made a deal and confessed to receiving expensive gifts and payment for overseas trips from lawyer Fisher in exchange for providing him with very secret investigative information. This was considered bribery and obstruction of justice by the judge. Malka was sentenced to 8 years in prison for his involvement in the fraudulent scheme. Before the verdict was delivered, he complained of unbearable conditions. He spent 4.5 months in solitary confinement. During his rare walks, he was led in handcuffs and leg irons. According to the former police major, thoughts of his children and psychotropic drugs helped him survive in such challenging conditions. Those are some complaints. Chinese corrupt officials would probably welcome life in solitary confinement. Corruption and abuses by officials are among the most frequently voiced complaints by Chinese citizens, and the leaders of the ruling Communist Party regularly warn that dissatisfaction with this issue could undermine party rule. For example, a former senior Chinese police official received a death sentence. But not just any death sentence. It's delayed for 2 years. This means that the death penalty will almost certainly be commuted to life imprisonment if Zheng doesn't commit any crimes while in prison. A court in northwestern China found Zheng Xiaodun, a former assistant minister of public security, guilty of accepting bribes totaling more than 8.3 million yuan, $1.2 million, during his tenure and earlier, when he headed investigations of economic crimes in the southern province of Guangdong. Details of the case are not disclosed in both the international and Chinese press. Agree. Not every police position allows you to demand such sums. An ordinary policeman is closer to ordinary people and goes to shopping centers or supermarkets, for example, like what happened in 2009. The end of April, Major Evsyukov, in a state of severe alcohol intoxication, arrives at the Ostrov supermarket in the south of Moscow after a fatal altercation with a driver, enters the store and starts shooting. By that time, the major had been celebrating his birthday for a week, drinking daily with friends. On that day, he had a big fight with his wife and left the restaurant where the celebration was taking place. It's unknown why Evsyukov started a massacre in the supermarket, what he disliked so much. According to one version, the major had a bout of white fever, and according to another, the combination of psychotropic drugs and alcohol exacerbated his mental disorder. The fact remains, Elvira Turdueva and Sergei Evteev, who drove the major, died. Another 7 people suffered serious injuries and were taken to the hospital. Evsyukov was arrested by police officers. Later, he was sentenced to life in prison. It is believed that this incident was one of the reasons for the reform of the Ministry of Internal Affairs in Russia. Generally, in such moments, police officers often attribute their transgressions to the tough and low-paying job. This was also the case with warrant officer Alexei Smirnov. For a long time, he extorted money from citizens he detained for minor infractions at the Barrikadная metro station in Moscow. Eventually, his activities drew the attention of the Ministry of Internal Affairs' own security department. On September 18, 2019, during an attempted arrest for bribery, which was captured on video cameras, Smirnov opened fire with his service weapon. Policeman Maxim Vielko was killed on the spot, and his partner Alexei Limonov was severely wounded. He was rushed to the hospital and underwent surgery. In April 2021, the warrant officer was sentenced to 19 years in a high-security prison. The court also ordered him to pay approximately 2 million rubles as compensation to the family of the deceased. Excesses also occur in the United Kingdom, and they can be as complex as an English detective story. The main character here is Jamshid Ali Dizai, a native Iranian. Upon joining the Metropolitan Police, he often criticized the London police in the media for racial and religious discrimination. He even wrote columns in newspapers, which made him quite famous. And then, as they say, watch what happens next. On July 18, 2008, near his uncle's restaurant in West London, Dizai arrested 24-year-old web designer Waad al-Baghdadi. The dispute between Dizai and Baghdadi arose over £600 that Dizai's uncle had not paid to the designer for creating a website. An arrest occurred during a public argument. However, Baghdadi filed a complaint about an unlawful arrest, and after an investigation on September 18, 2008, Dizai was suspended from duty. In January 2010, Dizai was charged with misconduct in public office and perverting the course of justice, and on February 8, 2010, he was found guilty and sentenced to 4 years in prison. But Dizai didn't stop there and filed several appeals against both his conviction and sentence. The basis for his proposed appeal was that al-Baghdadi was in the country illegally and using a false name and citizenship. So on May 16, 2011, the Court of Appeal overturned Dizai's sentence and he was immediately released, despite Baghdadi being suspected of fraudulently obtaining benefits, not giving false testimony. But that's not the end of it. By February 13th, Baghdadi had been arrested again, this time for the rape of a Muslim girl in April and September 2010. He also faced charges of fraudulently obtaining benefits, amounting to over £27,000. However, the prosecutor didn't forget about Dizai, who had by then been reinstated at Scotland Yard. The prosecution argued that Dizai had systematically abused his power for personal matters. On January 25, 2012, the prosecution presented medical evidence that Dizai had staged physical injuries to create the impression that Baghdadi had attacked him on July 18, 2008. Despite Dizai's claims in court that Baghdadi had behaved irrationally and frightened Dizai's wife and other witnesses, and despite Dizai's assertion that Baghdadi had pushed him twice and struck him with a hookah pipe on February 13, 2012, Dizai was once again found guilty of misconduct in public office and attempting to pervert the course of justice. The jury's verdict was unanimous. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison for each count. Subsequent appeals did not help the dishonest cop, and he could no longer work in the police force. Baghdadi was allowed to apply for asylum in the UK despite his previous criminal activities. This police officer got off relatively easy, didn't he? On the other hand, he didn't torture anyone, not like the infamous Kazan Dalny police station. On March 11, 2012, Sergei Nazarov died as a result of the abuse by officers of the Dalny OVD, Interior Ministry Division. Yes, Nazarov wasn't an angel. He had been in prison 6 times. But Dalny officers used torture to extract a confession from him for the theft of a mobile phone. According to a medical examination, the cause of Sergei Nazarov's death was rectal ruptures inflicted on him with a champagne bottle. After this, a large-scale investigation began, exposing the police officers at the Dalny station, who had created a whole scheme for extracting confessions. Some detainees were simply beaten, while those who refused to sign confessions were subjected to torture with pencils, pens, and bottles. Officially, 15 victims of physical violence by police officers in this OVD were found. The Dalny officers received sentences ranging from 15 to 2.5 years in prison. The harshest sentences were handed down to the former deputy head of the Criminal Investigation Department of the Dalny police station, 15 years in a maximum security colony, and the former deputy head of the department, 10 years in a maximum security colony. And the next story will be about a person who made a career out of fighting corruption and organized crime. Chinese police chief Wang Lijun fought so vigorously against the triad, the Chinese mafia, that this story became the basis for the TV series Iron-Blooded Police Spirits. Years of fruitful work and collaboration with Chinese politician Bo Xilai led to the arrest of about 6,000 people in 4 years, including wealthy businessmen, government advisors, criminal authorities, and senior police officers. The South China Morning Post reported that local criminal authorities once offered a reward of 6 million yuan for Wang's head. But in 2012, Wang Lijun was transferred to a less significant position. Although there are few details about this case, many sources suggested that the reason for the demotion was a falling out within the partnership. It was as if Wang, in order to strike a more favorable deal with the Discipline Inspection Commission, promised to provide evidence of Bo's or his wife's embezzlement and corruption schemes. Bo Xilai didn't like the Commission's intense scrutiny of his affairs, and in retaliation ordered the arrest of several of Wang's close associates. Wang Lijun became frightened and fled to another city, seeking American asylum at the consulate. However, Wang was not granted asylum, and as soon as he left the consulate, he was arrested. In September 2012, Wang was charged and convicted of abuse of power, bribery, desertion, and self-serving violation of the law. To give you an idea of the amounts involved, he was accused of taking bribes totaling around $450,000 from a Dalian millionaire businessman, Su Min, in exchange for releasing 3 people from police custody, as well as approximately $32,000 for renting out his country house in Chongqing to another businessman in exchange for releasing a suspect. While not huge sums by China's corrupt standards, Wang was found guilty on all 4 counts and sentenced to 15 years in prison. And he was actually lucky. With his testimony in court, he severely compromised his former colleagues in Bo's family. Wang exposed the scandal surrounding the murder of British businessman Neil Haywood, for which Bo Xilai's wife, Gu Kai-lai, was found guilty. She received a death sentence with a 2-year reprieve. Bo Xilai himself was sentenced to life in prison for corruption and other charges. And a bit more about police abuse. On the night of January 22, 2012, in St. Petersburg, 15-year-old Nikita Leontiev mysteriously died. He was returning home after practice when he was detained by 3 police officers who accused him of robbery, claiming that he had beaten a certain Svetlana Kuznetsova and taken her purse with 300,000 rubles. During questioning at the police station, the teenager fell ill. An ambulance was called for Nikita, but the medics couldn't save him. Leontiev died on the way to the hospital. After the teenager's death, a criminal case was initiated against him for robbery. An examination revealed that the teenager died due to a fracture of the temporal bone. More than 100 injuries were found on Nikita's body. Later, one of the police officers, District Officer Ivanov, confessed to beating the teenager but couldn't give a reason for his actions. The other police officers refused to provide incriminating testimony. Later, 3 police officers involved in the incident were dismissed from the force. Major Alexei Malich died before the investigation concluded. Lieutenant Ivanov received 6.5 years in a maximum security prison, and Major Prokhorenko received 9 years in a standard regime colony. It was only in 2014, after the police officers were sentenced, that Nikita was posthumously acquitted. So these are the stories of police abuse and corruption that we've gathered for you today. What do you think? Are the punishments fair? Well, we say goodbye for now. See you in the next videos on the channel.